whether it's for me, whether it's a mental file cabinet or one on your computer or an actual, file cabinet with papers in it, which I'm old school, I still have, is how can we be prepared so that opportunity arises, we're ready to go. And some of that is just some organizational things that you can be collecting now. Some of you might be the executive director of your organization and it's readily available. And some of you might have to talk to people to collect that information. So it's always good to have it. And we'll start a little bit with agency history. And that's just the nuts and bolts of who you are, making sure that if you're applying for grants, if you're a large organization, does it go to your central address? Or if you're an affiliate or a division, do you apply independently of that? Every application,
let me just print this out
a little bit of
okay?
the history of your organization. And I call that your elevator speech. This isn't a start of in the beginning, we were created, and then you kind of walk through the
What's that coming up there?
So have I been on mute the whole time, Kathy? All right, well, we'll start over. I apologize. I was off to the races.
Last 30 seconds.
Nancy, it was just a few seconds. That was my fault.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
In the background.
I'm
Sorry.
talking and
Sorry.
all righty. So if it's just a few seconds, I'm going back into organization history and making sure that you have that put together in a convenient spot so you can kind of pull it out and plug it into the pieces of the grant application that are going to need it. Oftentimes, if you're a small organization like we are, that's readily available. But when I work for some larger organizations or the state of Michigan, sometimes those questions aren't as easily answered because are you answering it for your division or your department or your organization as a whole? Tax information. I know for every community foundation, we're going to ask for what's your tax exempt status letter. What identifies you from the IRS as being a 501c3. Do you need a DUNS number? Are there other numbers that you might need to have in place? And I know we're working on Kathy's instituted a transportation grant, and one of our organizations needs to have a cage number and a SIMS number. So make sure that you walk through those processes early so it won't hold up your grant application. Things like financial information. Most organizations are always going to ask for your organization budget. Make sure it's handy, or make sure you have your projection in place, your financial statements, most recent audited financial statements. Some small nonprofits don't necessarily get an audited financial statement, but make sure you have the pieces in place to answer those questions. What are the sources of funding? Again, if you're not the leader, you might not know of, are you all funded through private donations? Are you funded through federal funds or state funds or local funds? And what are those allocations thereof? Typically, you're going to want to have in place the pieces of your governance of your organization. If you have a board of directors, if they're required to give so much financially each year, do you have an organization chart? Things like current strategic plans, articles of incorporations, and key staff. Lots of times grants applications ask who's in charge of this project. And so if you have those bios put together, it's easy to pull up and insert where you need to have. These are just kind of what I call the housekeeping things that it's always good to have ready and at your fingertips. So again, you're not spending the time on what might be a limited application window to pull that information together.
Right. Nancy, I agree entirely on all of those fronts. And I agree with too, you could do it old school and just keep a paper file of all of these essential documents. I like to be able to touch things and see things all spread out on a table. or people are much more digitally savvy than I have electronic files. I will say this initial screen might seem a bit daunting to some small nonprofits or service organizations. You might be looking at that and thinking, I don't even think we have half of those. That may in fact be the case. And so don't worry about that. Each grant opportunity that comes up will vary in sophistication. It will vary based on whether it's a foundation you're applying to, a community foundation, a national private foundation, or a government agency. They all vary, but these are like a long list of documents that, collect what you have and keep them in a file. But don't let it daunt you. If you can't check every box, that doesn't mean that you won't be eligible for any grant, but that's a great laundry list. The next thing we wanted to talk about really were goals and objectives. And these are the nuts and bolts of most grant applications, wherever you write them, to a varying degree of sophistication again. The thing that comes top of mind, because I just talked about it with somebody earlier today, I'll just put this in a framework of a grant that I've actually applied for a couple of times and have a passion for, and then we can talk through the different elements of SMART goals and objectives. I have a passion around farm to school. Basically, I'm a retired educator, and so it was always pretty significant for me to make sure that every boy and girl at whatever age had good, healthy food options. And so if you think of that as a framework, and then we walk through the SMART goals and objectives, the S is for specific. I almost feel like I'm going to break into some type of a rap song, but I won't because I'm not talented at that. But S is for specific, meaning what do you want to accomplish? What I want to accomplish with Farm to School is I want to feed students grades K-12 healthy foods. That's my specific goal. Who needs to be included in that? I need to include in this grant, I'm specifically targeting students, K-12. I might actually be targeting low-income students. It just depends on what your grant proposal is. The when and the why. This is a one-year program that I'm applying for, and the why, because we have more low-income students than we've ever had before. This is, a time that we need it. So how is that measurable? Can you measure this? Yes, I can. I can measure it by ways of the different foods that we would be able to provide, maybe more fresh foods. I would be able to measure it according to student satisfaction through a survey, a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data. We'll get to that in a little bit later. But so I'd be able to measure actually the number of students that are eating school lunches. So those are just some high level ways that I could measure a farm to school project. Is it achievable? Now, if I were a one-room schoolhouse with 15 students and I'm asking for $1 million, it's automatically not achievable. You can't spend that much money on food to feed that low number of students. But if I'm asking for $500,000 for a district of 900, and I have the superintendent's buy-in, and I have the food service director's buy-in, and I have local farmers buy-in, suddenly this seems very achievable. Is it relevant? Again, you have to paint the picture. Is it relevant? It's relevant because I have a high instance of low income in my school district. So it's very relevant. And we don't have many fresh products. It's mostly heat and eat products. So we want to be more nutritionally savvy and provide kids healthier meals. It is relevant. Is it time bound? Are there deadlines? Well, there's no deadline to food security, but there is a timeline with the grant. I'm applying for 3 years. And so again, I'm going to paint the picture that I can do what I say I'm going to do, achieve the goals I want to achieve, measure the things I want to measure in that timeline. So again, you want to be specific. You want to be able to measure what it is you're doing. How are you going to actually measure your success? that can be daunting sometimes to people. Sometimes it's just very simple and we make it more difficult than it really is. It depends on what your what your goal is. Is it going to be achievable for you? They're going to look at your organization. They're going to look at your staff. Some grants you can't even apply for unless you have at least one full-time person. So, you have to look at those RFPs, those RFAs, request for proposal, request for application, those NOFAs, notice of federal grants. And each one's a little different, but these are things that you're going to look for. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and what's your time? Anything to add to that, Nancy, or are you ready for the next?
I'm ready for the next one. I think you did it great. And kind of carrying on with the theme of smart, we end with ER for so smarter goals. And it's really, how are you going to evaluate your project at the end to determine success? And I always like to look at any type of goal setting and application is really looking through the funder's eyes. What is their priority? What are they trying to achieve? And first of all, is your project relevant to that? And so you're going to look at those evaluations from your perspective are you providing that farm to table quality food for your students and meeting those objectives? But from the funder's perspective, do they have measurables they're looking for? And what's that evaluation going to look like? And some of the evaluation models might seem clear to you and some of them might not be so clear. But what is reasonable? Kathy's going to talk a little bit about quantitative and qualitative as we look down. But what is it that you're measuring? Is it number of students? Are we going to evaluate are they actually eating the food or are they tossing it? You have this great, healthy, nutritious food, but have you reduced waste? Have you increased the number of students that are actually participating in the school lunch program? This was Kathy's project, but I'm assuming those are type of the evaluations from the standpoint of your supply chain. Are the farmers able to provide the quantity of food that you're looking for in your local food sources? And then are you going to reevaluate it? I know when some of our projects, you're going to have those short-term goals to evaluate, but it might be down the road before you have the longer picture. I know here in Lapeer County, some of our grant writing and some of our projects have centered around our child savings account program. And so we evaluate it in the short term of how many students are actually putting money into their savings account. But we're going to reevaluate it in 13 years when they graduate from high school. Are they actually going to post-secondary learning? Are they enrolling in college? And are they enrolling in trades programs? So, that evaluation piece is important. You might have a very specific short-term project. We're going to build a building and your evaluations might be more of, was it completed on time? Did you have cost overrun? Some of those other pieces. Anything I missed?
No, very good. I would add one thing though. I have been involved in some grants before where they actually tell you up front as you apply in the request for proposal, they're telling you what you're going to measure. One of the instances that comes to mind is SAMHSA grants, substance abuse mental health grants, around, let's say you're applying to them because you want to institute in your community youth mental health first aid classes. They will entertain your application, but they're going to tell you up front what their evaluation will consist of. And they may evaluate 6 things. And that might be your reporting back to them on those 6 things. How many new trainers have you added to your community? How many people have you trained in your community? How many people have actually utilized the training in their community? So, sometimes grants are you're creating the project and you're creating the evaluation plan. Sometimes, again, just depends. The grantor sometimes will tell you what you're going to measure because they're really looking to make a specific impact in the world. And so they leverage that. So again, it's very much sensitive to what grant you're going after. we're being very global in our approach here because we're not really sure where everyone is in their grant journey, but please do realize that evaluation is sensitive, to the nature of the specific grant you would apply to. I think this next slide, is this funder a fit? I think this is really important. I'll address this from the vantage point of an executive director of a community foundation. Community foundations are typically regional. We have this service area, we have this geofence, and that's the area we serve. And so if we have an outside entity, an organization outside of our geofence applying for a grant, and they're 80 miles away from us and won't impact any of our residents in our community, we're likely not going to find them eligible. We likely won't entertain their grant application unless they've called ahead of time and talked to me and said, let me tell you how this impacts your community. So you really have to do your due diligence to make sure that the funder is a fit. Make sure you're eligible. So the points to check off. Have you reviewed the website of the funder? Do you understand their priorities? Priorities for funders change as time evolves. So sometimes the mission or priorities, for example, of a community foundation or a governmental agency change. Look what COVID did to us. As far as grants, COVID related missions really became priorities for almost all grantors. And so you always have to go to the site and you have to be sensitive to the grantor. Do they fit your project? Is your project a fit for their mission? Have you reviewed their annual report? Do you know what they look like? That's a possibility. I don't typically dig that deeply, but you could. Does the funder prioritize my population? Your population may be rural. Do they have a rural priority? The funder, I've bumped into this a lot because I've typically served rural entities and organizations. Sometimes I've looked at a funder and they're really looking to make urban impact. So, you want to clear that up ahead of time before you invest a lot of time and energy into coming up with a grant proposal. So make sure your priorities align with theirs. Awards amount similar to your ask. If I need $1 million and I'm going to my community foundation that has $20 million in assets, I'm probably not going to have a really good pitch because what I need doesn't align with their giving history. So be sure that you've done that due diligence too. Does the granting period fit? Again, if your project is time sensitive with a hard start date and a hard finish date, does it align to their giving?
Wallet. Okay, let's get you a phone and get.
And my project is detailed. Do you have enough details that will inform the grant reviewers as to who you are, what you want to do, and why it fits into their mission? And this one's very important, I think. I've called the funder to pitch my idea. I just did this 2 days ago. I farm food related. I called the Michigan Department of Education because they have an opportunity. I had a great concept. A wonderful concept. I pitched it. The lady said, that is phenomenal. I love the idea. That's not what we're looking for. So that conversation, that 10-minute phone conversation, saved me a boatload of hours in putting together an application that would have been glorious, I'm sure, right? Great, but it would have been sent to the wrong entity. So don't be afraid to call the number. Don't be afraid to find the project director at the agency or the executive director. Call them and say, I've done my due diligence. I've looked at your website and your history and your mission, and I think my project seems to fit. But can I pass it by you? I love it when I get those calls here. That's very helpful, both for us as grantors and very informative for the person trying to build a project. In fact, sometimes those conversations end like this, and I'm honest about this. Earlier this fall, I had a project idea, and I called the executive director of a large foundation. I actually got her on the phone. I said, this is my idea. I need $20,000 to make it happen. Should I apply on your website? She said, no, you shouldn't. I felt very daunted. I felt, well, okay, I guess I'll give that up. She said, you don't need to apply. I'm going to get into our foundation's donor advised fund and you will get a check for $20,000. Boy, was I ever glad I made that phone call. So do your due diligence. It's not always going to turn out that beautifully, but it will be informative. So I think maybe let's see. So call your funder, pitch the idea. And again, if they like it, or maybe they suggest you change it. I had that happen recently too. Somebody said, we like that idea, but we won't pay for anything capital. We only pay for project costs. Great, informed my budget, tweaked it, good to go. So call, email. When you're looking at a request for proposal, find that individual. And even though it might say US Department of Ed, don't let it get you. It's just a person at the other end. And they're generally very eager to talk to you. So with that, I tend to be long-winded. I apologize. Nancy, I don't think you could possibly add anything because I droned on pretty long about that slide. Let me toss it to Nancy on the next one.
All right. No, you did great, Kath. I will, though, if you didn't say it enough times, I will say we appreciate phone calls. Making that phone call saves time for everyone involved. You can get additional information. You can save yourself a lot of time in the long end. And from the funder end, you know, nothing is more frustrating as a director of a community foundation than, you know, someone took a lot of time to write a grant application and it came to you and you knew you weren't going to fund it. And you could have saved that person a lot of time and energy, maybe pointed them in a direction that might have been more successful to them and their organization. So, you know, it goes both ways, both as a grantee and a grantor, that those phone calls save time. The other thing I'll say, if Kathy didn't say it, is if you don't qualify and you don't meet the requirements, don't apply. And that's part of that initial phone call. But if you're looking at something in your a mental health organization that's dealing with social services and the grant application is to build a marina, don't try and make it fit that if I sail on a boat, I'll be more relaxed and it'll be better for our clients, especially if you live in the middle of the state. You know, it's just don't try to make Cinderella's shoe fit when it's meant for another individual. So this is really kind of starting to walk through the applications, and it starts with writing a thorough project description. And I'll tee it up a little bit by saying, this is your case for giving. This is where you're really going to lay out what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes it seems like a simple question to ask, but when you sit down to write, it can be more complicated. Because if you're like me, my thoughts go into a million different directions of the big picture and the small picture. But this is where you're really making your pitch of, why do we fund you? In the world of great projects and great organizations and limited resources, what's going to make your project stand out? And let's make sure that you've really kind of dialed down to what is the project description. You'll start by, you know, what's your response? You know, you've identified that problem in your community or your population, and that's your problem statement. And what will your organization's response be? I say you can also define that. What is your audience? You know, who are you trying to help, or what project are you trying to do? What's your hook? And that's really what makes you special. What's unique about your agency? What's going to make this project stand out of things that they're looking at? And can you identify that? What does the research say? Is there something that says that your approach makes sense? What's going to make it successful if they invest in you? Is this a best practice? Is it evidence-based? Has it been shown to be successful in other communities and you're trying to bring it to your community? Or is it just, you know, an idea that you had that you're going to see if it works? But the proposals are the most successful are the proposals that come that say, we've done our due diligence, we've done some background, here's some evidence and some research. This is how we've identified the problem. If you say that, in Kathy's case, we want to have farm to table and connect, local foods to our students. Does it say that it's healthier to eat, food that's been picked yesterday? Is what backs up your application? What your critics say? Find someone in your community or find someone that might have been a critic to your agency that has said, this isn't necessarily a good idea. And I don't really, not necessarily sure we need to go in that direction, because that's going to challenge you to make sure that your thought process is clear. It also challenges you because there's going to be a grant review committee and they're going to take a look at it and ask those very same questions. So finding that critical voice can help you have a much stronger proposal. And what are your milestones? I talk about the word here I highlighted as, when will you start a collaboration? I have found, and when I've written grant proposals, as well as when we funded, the projects that come to us that show a wider collaborative effort in the community are the most successful. It lets you know that it can be sustainable. It lets you know that there are others within your community that are trying to solve the same problem, that you're not working in silos, so that you don't have multiple organizations trying to solve the same problem with limited resource. And then what's the long-term look? As far as, are you going to have to hire staff down the road? As we looked at our child savings account program, we started with a collaborative effort, but knowing that as we grow from one cohort to 13 cohorts, are we prepared to meet those needs down the road? And then what are those milestones? When we get to X number of students or X number of classes enrolled, we know that we're going to have to be at this place funding wise and staffing wise. So that talks a little bit about the project description, but really making sure you can identify your audience, making sure that you can say, is this relevant to society? And then have you address the assets that you bring to the table. Did I miss something, Kathy?
I don't believe you did. Very well said. We're leaving ample time, by the way, at the end of this for Q&A and discussion, because as Nancy and I said at the beginning, neither of us do this full time. There's not going to be a slide at the end of this that's an I gotcha, like, oh, buy this from us. We're not selling anything. We just really love the work that grants do for communities and for schools. So before I address this next slide, I would just like to provide this intermission, if you will. The first grant that I ever wrote, I thought that I didn't have a prayer of getting it. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never taken any grant writing courses. There was a need, I thought. And I saw an opportunity and I thought, well, what am I out but a few hours, really? I'm very philanthropic in nature, but I haven't had deep pockets myself. So I've given of my time and my energy. So at any rate, with just a lot of passion around a certain topic, I composed a grant and I sent it in and I got $5,000 to do this project. At that point in time, I was like a positive addict. Like I became addicted to grant writing because I could see that it was possible. Like if you dream a project and you know it would have impact and you spend time and you have passion for it, you can make it happen. And it was from that one small grant that allowed for, honestly, a Earth Day celebration that grew into a countywide Earth Day celebration that's still there. It's kind of morphed a bit, but that was it. That got me hooked. So please don't let any of this, detail get you like, well, I can't possibly do this. I can't take the notes. Wherever you're at in this journey, you can do it. Energy, time, and passion. These are the ingredients. And then as Nancy pointed to in the previous slide, really a collaborative or coalition of people that kind of support you in this work. that encourage you. They're your cheerleaders, your researchers, just people who kind of hold you up are very important. So this next slide, this is something you would cover kind of in a college class, and then you might not revisit for a while until you're involved in a project or grant writing. But, there's really two kinds of data that you can collect, two different ways you can measure impact of a project, and they're both very valid. And you don't have to have both in any grant application. It really depends, again, on what you're hoping to do. The two types of information or evaluation are quantitative, which, as you would imagine, quantity is in there. So numbers are involved, collecting numbers somehow around your grant project and its outcomes. Qualitative is, again, more about the quality of the project. So that's going to be more perception based. It's going to be more survey driven. And it all depends upon really the grant that you're writing for. I referenced a substance abuse mental health grant around youth mental health first aid. And they were all about measuring impact by way of collecting data, again, on how many people trained, how many new trainers, how many people are responding to your surveys that have been trained and telling you that they've utilized the information. So those were the data points. There were some metrics that they wanted you to measure. Nothing real cumbersome, right? You just keep the track of those numbers, and that's what you report back on. Now, in that same project, some qualitative data might be survey questions around, how, even aside from the numbers that you're collecting, the data, collect information about how that training has changed the viewpoint of the people trained. Like, now that you're interacting with students, or you're interacting with clients, or you're interacting with seniors, whoever the group is, has it changed how you interact with them? So that's not necessarily a number that you're tracking. That's really perception. And that is really, really significant. I think sometimes qualitative data is more desirable than the quantitative. I'll give you another example. Just very recently, I asked an organization to provide me $10,000 to actually do an evaluation. And I had a scope of evaluation for the project. I put it before them, and they said, "We love that. That's great. We want to fund it, but you've got all quantitative stuff. That's all numbers. It's beautiful. We want this qualitative data." And so I changed it, and they loved it. So again, it's both are very, very important. So quantitative data can be pre-post test. Again, how many kids bought school lunch before farm to plate or farm to school? How many bought it interim the project? And then how many were buying at the end of the project? Track it. Was there a change? That's just an example. Participation, again, or financial reports. Like, if you're looking for, if you have a project and you're looking to engage disadvantaged farmers, which I've learned recently is a phrase, you're going to measure that. How many disadvantaged farmers did your project bring into the fold? How many did you partner with? And you're going to measure that. So that's a number. So qualitative, again, is more survey perception, interviews, focus groups, observations. I'm running an internship program. One of the evaluation points is to have interviews with the intern cohort, one-to-one, to basically get from them, what are they learning? How has it informed their aspirations or their career goals? So that's very, very important. Those are two things. You're never going to have to divide that out in a grant application. These are things to be kind of aware of on the back end as you're building your grant application. Quantitative, qualitative. So you don't necessarily need to define them in an evaluation section, but you might speak to one, you might speak to the other, you might speak to both. Just it depends on what grant application you're going after. Nancy, are you ready for the next one?
I am. As you look at that project description, again, every application is very different. Some are much more simple. Some can get a lot more complicated when you get into maybe some state and federal funding sources. But all of the requests for proposals or application portals will have a design set of questions. And as we walk through this, it seems very elementary, but please keep referring back to those questions and making sure that you're answering them, whether it be in your project descriptions or your evaluation proposals. I can't speak today. And that you're getting to the root of what they're asking for. Because I think, we all get off to the races and we're writing because we're passionate about the project. And then at the end of the day, you're thinking, well, as the evaluator, they didn't answer my specific question. So always go back through the lens of how is the question phrased and what are they trying to look for as you're putting that together. Which leads us into a little bit of minimalist writing tips. And I have to be honest, this is one that I always have to go back to because I just love to talk and I kind of write the way I talk and I can give you a 27-page project description and the evaluator's probably tired and bored by page 2 and might have tossed me on the pile. So I'm kind of one of those writers. It's really great when you have the boxes and you're limited to characters because it makes me really go back and say, have I been redundant and can I shorten this up a little bit to get to the meat of it? I think sometimes we think we can talk people to death and they'll just give us the money, and I tend to write that way too. So some of the writing tips as you go about it is, one, use a word processor. Every application, asks questions, and I just immediately start a Word document and I'll copy those questions and I'll stick them on the Word document and I answer them there so that I can go back and forth to the different sections. One might be harder to answer, so I'll skip to the next question and then I can go back to it. I have found with Kathy and some of the things we've jointly funded together is starting a Google Doc so that multiple parties can be working on the same application and you can go through and make those updates. I just worked with our someone from our local intermediate school district for a grant application, and it revolved around early childhood education. And so the two of us were able to simultaneously work on the same document and drop in data as it's collected. So start not writing in the actual application, but somewhere else. What do you want to remove? You want to remove weak punctuation or extra punctuation. Now's not the time to use every single punctuation mark on your keyboard. So make sure that you're not using extra things that don't need to be there or unnecessary repetition. Adjectives, one word can suffice as opposed to 27 saying the same things, or filler words because you feel they told you could use up to 5,000 words doesn't mean you have to. If you can say it in less and get your meaning across, you just need to get enough in there to adequately state what you need to state. Use active words of an active voice about what you are going to do or what you are currently doing. That is always really important. I say avoid using overly smart words. Sometimes, we want to try and drag out our dictionary and our thesaurus and use big words. But if it's not everyday speech from an evaluator, you don't want to have them, one, scratching their head going, what does that really mean? Or to maybe self-importanize what it is you're trying to get across. So I say simple language that everyone can understand that conveys what it is that you want to convey. Choose acronyms carefully. As a formal employee for the state of Michigan or in the government sphere, or maybe where you are in your organization, it's the alphabet soup of acronyms that you just assume everybody knows and you kind of get lost in the weeds. Try and minimize those. Try and make sure that you spell out what they might stand for because sometimes it's the same acronym in a different context and people aren't aware of what you're talking about. So you really kind of want to minimize your acronyms and make sure that you're clear on what they are. Characters do count in that early childhood grant that we recently applied for and successfully received. You were limited to 150 characters. So that cut and paste from your word processor from Word into there can help dramatically, and then just kind of following that at the bottom to say, yep, I'm still 300 over. Again, that helps you remove that redundancy.
Yeah, Nancy, great job. And I would interject just a couple of things that a great thing to do. I know everybody doesn't have extra time on their plate, but if you have an opportunity to volunteer to be a grant reviewer, it's one of the most informative actions you could take to become a better grant writer. One of the first times I engaged, I had written a whole bunch of grants, felt I was, okay at it, had a lot of room to improve, but somebody told me, they gave me the great insight, Kathy, you need to be a part of a grant review team. So actually the Michigan Department of Ed was looking for reviewers. So I signed up. I went for 2 days and I was a reviewer of I think 21st century grant applications. So I became instantly like aware of reading a grant application that had like alphabet soup. I didn't know what they were talking about, or a grant application that gave me no background about, I don't know where this town X is. I don't know their demographics, that kind of left these big questions. If you have an opportunity, maybe even at your local community foundation, because we're always looking for volunteers to review grant applications or scholarship applications, take that step and review some, and you will gain a lot of insight from that about a lot of these things. Like just saying, wow, this person has some great content. They probably should have had a friend or a colleague proof it, because they're the grammar or the spelling really takes away from the meaning. Just simple things. You will gain great experience. And then Nancy had mentioned, and I'll just reiterate, that the grant writing process has been very streamlined by a lot of grantors, because you do have these text box scenarios, which is great because they want you to get to the point in a very succinct way, and it forces you to do so. I'd also point out that like through grants.gov, which I know a lot of people, that's a turnoff. They'll probably just sign off when they hear that. Grants.gov and a lot of other agencies have gone to a situation where there are multiple people that can be working on a grant application, which is fantastic. Your CFO can be on there working on the budget. You can be on there working on the background information. So multiple people can be working. And I think that's really a savvy approach too. So again, it depends. A local foundation, Department of Ed, are you working on grants.gov? It's all just sensitive to where you're applying. I would also say, and then I'll turn the next slide back over to Nancy. Nancy does things first in Word. And believe it or not, in the day, I taught some English. And I think the old-fashioned way, I think best first on legal paper. I have to jot notes physically. Has to be read through the eye, thought in the head, and come out my hand on paper. It's old school, but that's what works for me. Nancy thinks well with Word documents. And I think, again, I'm sensitive to that. We're all different and have different learning styles. So you just kind of have to go with what speaks to you. And there's no right or wrong. And I know Nancy wasn't indicating that her way was the only right way, but there are some old school people like me that just really like paper. And the benefit of paper too is simply I take it on the road. I'm not writing while I'm driving, but if my husband's driving or we're going on vacation, I can be doodling over there on my notes and I get a lot accomplished that way. Having said all of that, Nancy, we're still on minimalist proofing.
All right.
Kathy or Nancy, can I jump into?
Yeah.
We have, we do a lot of grants at the Michigan Community Foundation or Community Service Commission. And I have realized that one of the most important things is to read the question and just answer it. I love what you've said about succinct. I love what you said about don't try to be pull out your thesaurus, just be simple, make it clear. You understand the question and then just answer the question. And the tips that I used to do is almost rephrase the question in my first line and then answer it. Not exactly, but it worked every single time. And that is what I answered. I might take it out at the end, but if I understood the question, we just had a recent one where it was clear a lot of people didn't answer the question, and understand that if a grantor is asking for it, they're looking for that information on the first go around to whether you're going to go on to round 2 or you're going to get cut right from the beginning. So be careful about understanding what they're asking. And if you're really not sure, call. Someone has asked that question. I don't mind if you leave a voicemail. I'll call you back. But that's really important. So I just wanted to say thank you. These are great points.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, that is so important. Read the questions. If you're not sure, call us. I saw that in the chat box, and I love speaking with folks. So just give us a call and we'll get back to you. And, we want you to be successful, but please don't not answer the question. Most online applications won't allow you to submit with an empty box. We do some still old school where you can send it in. But if you haven't answered the question, that's going to reflect negatively upon you. So if you don't know it, find out the information. Again, that can go back to, is this the right fit? Because if the questions we're asking aren't relevant to what your project is, that's a bigger conversation to have. And so kind of walking through it and saying, how does this relate to my project, can give you some of those answers up front. Moving along, we have the minimalist writing tips. There's some proofing tips as well. Again, this might seem old school, but I'm always amazed at applications that come in, and I have to use it myself when I'm writing. Read your responses aloud. Oftentimes, if we're writing it and you reread what you've written multiple times, you're going to still miss that mistake. But if you actually read it aloud, you might catch that word that doesn't fit, or that sentence that might be a little bit of an add-on sentence or not make sense. So read it aloud. You're going to want to, again, remove any weak punctuation or extra punctuation, any unnecessary repetition. I find when I read my answers aloud, I'm like, well, I've already said that 3 times in other sections. It might not be relevant here. Unnecessary adjectives or filler words. Fix any sloppy grammar. Again, utilize the tools that your word processor might have, but fix, again, some jargons or some things that might be a little sloppy, and tighten that up. And I can't stress enough, ask someone to read it. Share your proposal with someone. It can be a coworker or colleague. It might be someone from a different organization. Unfortunately, my spouse oftentimes I make him read it because he isn't in my world. And so I'll be like, if you're someone that doesn't know anything about us or our project, do you know something about it at the end? And what questions would you have? And it's great, the feedback that you get from someone completely outside of your sphere, to see if it's clear and makes sense. And then repeat the above. One of the things as we talk about Google Docs or collaboration of multiple people putting their input into your application, is making sure you're reviewing each other. Because I've been involved in situations where we're all working on it and it's at a deadline, and you're just assuming, everybody else has walked through these same tips, and it gets submitted and you're like, ooh, I wish we would have reviewed it because, Nancy had a big mistake. And Kathy didn't have the time to fix it. So that's part of that collaborative approach of making sure someone reads it and that it makes sense. I know it's not really grant applications, but we're in scholarship season. So for a community foundation, it's a big time of year, and we get a lot of young people writing scholarships for funding, and the proofing tips. Many of them need to kind of go back to look through these things, and our reviewers, if it says 150 words or less, they're counting words, And it's being used against some of the students just by not following what the directions were to begin with. Kathy?
All good points. I would say, this sounds like dismissive of everything we just covered, and it's not. I am so imperfect when it comes to the written word. I'm passionate. I think I'm fairly clear. But I always have an extraneous mistake, usually because of timelines. And so timelines are really important to look at. Be working on grant applications all along. Don't wait like a high school student. I hate to be biased like that, but when I was in high school, I waited until the night before to write papers. You know, you can't do that with a grant because often there's all this background information and documents you need to collect. And sometimes you need to get logged into some system and it takes some time. So, you know, time is important, and don't feel like everything has to be perfect, because I know I've pitched some grants before that had some grammatic or spelling errors because I caught them on the back end after I submitted, and they've still been approvable. So don't let that eat you up, but we just always want to do our level best. And so these are great tips. So we're going to move along here, and again, we'll have plenty of time for questions. This is just a really high level list, if you will, of typical parts of a grant. Again, this will change. Different grantors have different things, but these are items that you're typically going to address on any grant. Obviously, one of the first things that on federal applications you have to do is you have to do a 1 sentence to 3 sentence summary of your project. And that is typically used in public relations. When they award, they grab that high level summary, and that's what they push out to the public. These are the grant recipients, and these are but that work is really important. Be able to summarize it in a short amount of time. That helps you. The more streamlined it is, the more organized your thoughts. If you can put it into a little nugget or a short paragraph, the better off you are. Most grant applications are going to request that you provide them your need. For example, if I live in a really affluent neighborhood and we already have an art studio and I'm applying someplace to build another art studio kitty corner from the one that exists, that's not demonstrating any need. And so you need to often, pardon the pun, you need to identify your need. Again, just examples. Farm to school is needed because we have a high population of low-income students and we don't have many fresh foods in our food menu. Those are needs. And you can research that and provide data for that. Arts, back to like the National Endowment for Arts or a local arts funder, you're going to probably talk about how your community that you're hoping to support doesn't have existing arts that they can go to and appreciate. There's no art museum, there's an absence of it, or there's an absence of it in your school. So you're looking to touch the community with arts, and it's very significant. There's a very significant need. So really most grants come from a need base, right? They're not looking to line the pockets of some organization that already has ample money or a community that has ample money. Most grants come from a need base. So it is up to you, it is imperative to you as the grant writer to identify that need, quantify it if you can. Really, a compelling need section can be 3 to 5 pages. I mean, that's typically my strength in any grant application. And if I've ever divided a grant up, people will give me need because that's something that I know is very crucial. So demographics, finances, past achievements to kind of warrant the fact that you've come this far, and this grant would just kind of push you over the edge to be even more impactful. your level of engagement with the community, and a lack of a particular service. Again, fresh food, lack of fresh food, lack of arts or presence of arts in your community. So you need to come from a need base. You need to be able to, and we kind of already addressed this, but outline your project. What are the activities you're proposing? What are your goals, objectives again? And oftentimes grants will ask for a timeline, sometimes not real sophisticated, but they're looking, okay, where are you going to hang these project activities, right? This is a year-long project. So you're just going to outline for them, you know, perhaps month by month. That's typically how I do a timeline. These are the activities in month 1, activities in month 2, so that they know that you have the thought, the bandwidth to carry this project out. You have a plan and you have a timeline and you have goals and your objective. Very important. Another thing that you're going to want to do is, again, outline your project management team. Youth mental health first aid. I'll go there again. You need people that can get trained in youth mental health first aid. So I reached out to a local mental health agency and they partnered with me. That's significant, right? That's in my grant application. So I have staffing. Do I have capacity? So again, if it's the district, a school district that's taking this project on, I'd have my chief financial officer maybe write a letter of support, like this is a need in our district and we have this amount of asset and we are able, I'm full-time employed, I have a staff, yada, yada. We are able, we have the capacity to build this program out. So those are all very important elements of a grant application. Project management, they give you this money. Do you have the people in place to carry out the work? Very significant. The evaluation plan, again, quantitative and qualitative data. What are you going to track? Why is it important? A budget. This is really a weakness of mine. I understand money. I understand the movement of money. I can make a list, but I'm not real good at spreadsheets. So I usually tell somebody, this is what I want to do. This is the amount I'm going to ask for. This is what I'm going to do with the money. I get that. You put it in a fancy spreadsheet. And usually I have a good colleague that will do that for me to make it look better than what I can do. So, but a budget. And we'll go over the different line items in a budget, just very globally. Again, required documents. Grant application often will require a list of your board members and in their affiliations, right? Board member is Joe Schmo. He's a board member on the senior agency on aging, but he is also affiliated with the local bank. You know, so they get a texture of who represents your organization. And that's really important. They often ask for an organizational budget, like what's your, like if I'm an applicant as for County Community Foundation, they're going to ask for my audits, you know, the last 3 years to make sure that we're good with money and that our audits are clean. So they'll ask for 3 years of those potentially. And again, this is all basically based on who you're applying to. Also, they sometimes will require that you provide them evidence of a 501c3 status. This could be, again, we addressed this earlier, it could be your articles of incorporation. It could be, sometimes they request, I've bumped into recently, certificate of, what is it called? Good standing. That's actually a certificate you get online. You go to Lara and you put your agency in there and they kind of vet you and they don't see any red flags. They give you a certificate of good standing. And then sometimes you have to present that. So again, different grantors request different things. This last point I think is really, really important. When I was new at grant writing and I had a project, I just went out and I got a whole bunch of people to write like, yay, this is great. I'm a cheerleader. This will be wonderful. This project, go get them, Kath. And like, then as I got a little more sophisticated, I'm like, that's not enough. Like, it's okay to have a couple letters like that from cheerleaders, but you really want letters of partnership. You want letters of collaboration. You want letters that say, we are not only supportive, we're going to work in this project with either time, talent, or treasure. You know, we're skin in the game. And that's really significant. For example, right now, some of us on this call are working on a transportation grant. And so some of the letters are, Nancy's written a letter of support, of potential financial support from her foundation. I've written a letter of support from our foundation, a letter of commitment from the agency that we're partnering with, saying, yes, we will provide staff and we will provide training. And so those are significant, as you can imagine, to a reviewer, because you're not just asking for money. You don't just ask for money and have a really good plan. You have a team of people with skin in the game. So that's really crucial when you can do it. Anything you want to weigh in on there, Nancy?
Nope, I think you did great.
All right. Thank you for your endorsement. This next part, again, is just a high level, kind of a repeat, I think, of other things. Things that you'll often be called upon to do. An executive summary, that's just being able to, again, paragraph, this is what we're going to do. A project summary is larger generally. You're going to have a problem statement. In other words, what's the need? What's the gap you're trying to fill? Your project description, this is your narrative about your program. What's your project? What are you going to do? Again, the goals and objectives, we've talked about that. The timeline that you're going to do these goals and objectives, a budget and a justification. This is kind of crucial too. In the budget world, as we review grants here at the Community Foundation, it is always very informative, but just a small scale grant, right? Like a teacher at a school is writing to put in a sensory garden. And so they don't just give us $5,000 from the sky. They've actually gone on the World Wide Web and they found this item, this item, this item, and they'll attach it. Like, this is kind of what we're looking for. This is what our budget is based on. Reviewers eat that up. It's like, wow, they've done their due diligence. These are warranted costs that they put in their budget, and it kind of seals the deal. So do that homework. Again, another example, we're writing for a transportation project, a couple of vehicles. So I went out and I got a couple of bids or potential costs for those vehicles. And so I'll provide that information just so that they know I've kind of vetted that out. It's not a made up number. Very important. Your evaluation plan, again, we've gone over that, qualitative, quantitative. What are you going to measure? Sustainability is always a big one when you're asking for a lot of dollars. Transportation, I'm not asking for this amount of money in our current project, but if I were, just hear me out. If I were to ask for $3 million in vehicles for improved transportation for our senior citizens and our marginalized populations who have great transportation needs. So I'm asking for multi-millions of dollars. And then when it all dries up and goes away, I'm not addressing, like, when that funding's gone, like, what are we going to do? If those are the only dollars that I have to operate on for always, the grantor's going to say, we're not going to fund that. They have no way to sustain that program once our funding is gone. So it is our due diligence to have partners in the grant application and partners in the project that will speak to the sustainability, so that you could say, when this funding is gone, we will have this group of people working together and these funding streams possibly coming in so that the project can be sustained. Or maybe hypothetically, you're hoping to educate the public and get more donations, depend upon the project that you're applying for. But think through the sustainability. Don't ask for pie in the sky. And then as a former boss always said, once the funding goes away, we can't fall off the cliff. And I thought that was great. That is very true. So you have to look past the grant. Very, very important. That's, most grants will ask you to have a sustainability plan. Quite honestly, some of the federal funds that I have been able to get have been multi-millions, and that sustainability section honestly hasn't been pages in length. It has been like, up to a page. It's just thoughtful. Like, this is what we're thinking. And your management plan. If the management plan of a big multi-million-dollar project is just Kathy Dickens, That's not going to get too far. I need more people at the table. What's your management plan? Who's involved in carrying this grant out? Again, the reviewer is going to be looking at that to make sure that it's meaningful and that you have the right players. Name them. You're often going to not only name them, you're going to include their resume so that they can see their background. For example, farm to school. I'll just call on that one again. Part of my management team was my CFO. I included the chief financial officer. I included his resume. Food service director. I included her resume. I had an evaluation plan that was really not huge, but it was good. And it was prepared by a professional evaluator. I provided her credentials and her resume. So that's really, really informative to reviewer and very impressive that you've done your homework. A bibliography, if you're making lots of references, and I will say if it's an application process that's not at the federal level, it's more local. I think most local reviewers would take just in parentheses, cite your source. If you're going to drop a data point, 87% of our population doesn't have transportation, for example. You can't just put that down with no reference to where you're getting that. If you're getting that from the US Census in 2010, put that in parentheses. More sophisticated applications that have more research are going to actually have a whole reference section. But for most people on the call, that's probably not the reality. You're going to have appendices on some of the larger grant applications, but those are high level things that just typically are called upon. So be prepared for them. With that, we're going to go on and talk about my favorite section, which I'm glad to pass the baton over to Nancy.
Thanks. So this is a section where oftentimes people's eyes can glaze over, and I would hazard to guess there's people on this call that are much, much more sophisticated than myself. I won't include Kathy in that, but the budget and numbers are where sometimes people head for the woods and get scared to address it. And I'll start with a few things. This is obviously an extremely simple budget template. As we were sorting through the millions of examples that we could have thrown up here, we just decided to go simple, and it could get more complicated from here. But the bottom line is the budget is your justification for the ask, right? It's doing the due diligence of this is how we arrived at that $3 million number, or that $5,000 number, or that $1,000 number. I think, folks on this call, and I know Kathy is my cohort as a community foundation, I get asked weekly, if not daily, of how much can we ask for, right? Like, what's the right amount to ask for? And my answer is always, what does it take to get your project done? You're building the budget based on what is that need. If you're just kind of on a fishing expedition to see how much you can get, sophisticated reviewers are going to see through that real quick, because your numbers aren't going to add up, or it's not going to make sense. So I always say, make sure you've addressed the ask. Oftentimes we think that we're going to over ask, but I've had equal number of applications where you've under asked. And I've made sure that I haven't under asked when I've applied for things, because have you covered all those unforeseen costs that might arise, whether they be administrative, whether they be supplies or equipment, or program operations. So there is no magic number. I mean, there might be a magic number, as Kathy said in the beginning. If you're applying to a community foundation that has assets of $10 million and you have a $3 million ask, you're probably just out of the ballpark. But you're really building what does your project need, and then you're going to see the funders that might be able to support that need, or build those collaborative efforts to have it in place. So as we start looking at that budget template, you're going to start with your expenses, and is there any revenues to the project? Starting with expenses, does your project have salaries and benefits? Do you need to hire people? If it's a mobility project, do you need to hire drivers? Do you need to hire a dispatcher? Do you need to have those people in place? And what are all those costs associated with the employees? Are there operating expenses? Are there marketing expenses to the program? You know, we'll have people apply because they want to put on a workshop or they're going to have an event. So how are they going to get people to their event? You know, is there a website? Is there flyers? Is there advertising? So that you have those pieces in place. Are you recognizing funders? You know, sometimes we've had where most recently in a local city here in our county, they built a dog park. And part of that dog park project was that they were going to recognize funders of the project. And so, you know, simple things of those signs cost money. And have you actually gone and researched what that cost is going to be and put that as part of your budget? Think about, you know, all of those related expenses. Books and materials. Do you have equipment that's required? Do you have installation costs that are part of it? Transportation costs to get, you know, delivery charges there. Obviously with COVID, those timelines might be longer and those costs might be higher. And so we're always talking to grantees about being mindful of that timeline for getting your project in and where it might launch, and have you built in that those might have escalated somewhere along the line. Are there travel costs? If you're having a project that your staff has to be traveled or to travel to a conference, let's say it might be a new software purchase, they need to get trained. And so it might be either travel costs for your staff or travel costs for a consultant that's going to come in to make sure that your project's up and running and you can use that software, or any other expenses that might be part of this. And Kathy's going to walk through in a little bit some indirect and direct costs, but you're going to start building that expense portion of your project. I can't emphasize enough, if you can get quotes. You can get them on the web. You can ask vendors to provide quotes. Most recently, we had an application here at the Community Foundation. They were looking for the purchase of some temporary ramps for individuals in their homes that might have a short-term medical need. So they were looking to fabricate some aluminum ramps. And there were no real quotes in there. They just said, we have a local fabricator that can do it cheaper. And so really that necessitated a call to the applicant to say, well, how did you come up with this number? And while it's kind of a ballpark number, no two ramps are the same because houses are different. You know, you might have a 1 foot versus a 3 foot incline. You might have a longer distance from the driveway to the front door. You might have radiuses. So, you know, they were just looking to get 2 ramps that then could be retrofitted per client. And so we really had to have that conversation of, okay, they're all different, but has a ramp been built recently by this fabricator? And how about you provide what that estimate was? And then we can build from there, which led to the second question of, when that ramp is done with the first client, who is covering the cost to have those additional pieces put in so that it can be used for the next client? And does your organization have that capacity to provide that funding? Again, things that weren't in the original application, they might not have had that information, but those are the types of questions a reviewer is going to ask. And if you can anticipate that and provide some documentation up front to those cost estimates, that's what we're looking for. Not providing the information typically is not going to lead to a successful application or address it. If you don't have it, if it calls for 2 quotes, typically we'll ask for 2 estimates or 3 estimates, but maybe there's only 1 provider of that service or that product, or they're the only ones that do it effectively for school districts. Put that in your budget narrative. You know, address that. I only am submitting 1 quote because, and give the reasoning why. They are, you know, the leader in the industry, or they're the only one that meets this need, so that we're not left guessing. Mm-hmm. The second part is your revenues. Is there any money coming into this project? Is there client contributions? So do people have to pay to attend your event, or do they have to pay a piece of the service but it's subsidized through grant funding or your organization. So is there donations for service? Are the individual donors? Is there fundraising? So are you fundraising to help provide additional revenue to the project? Where are you at in those efforts? Have you done it? And how much have you raised? Are you going to do it? And what's your anticipated goal for that? So that we know what that piece is. Then you can look at, are we the only grant? So grant A might be something that you have that's pending to cover part of the costs. Grant B might be that this grant proposal. We oftentimes are looked at as a source of match. We love playing that role. We love being part of a larger collaboration. Most recently, we had a township in our county that's putting together a big park project. They're applying to the Michigan Department of Natural Resource for a Passport to Recreation grant. The project cost is $250,000. They asked us for $25,000 in local match to meet that piece. And so we were able to come in as that match piece, but their grant proposal showed where we were. It showed where their local other match was coming from. Some of it was their community, some of it was other local resources. They showed the Michigan Department of Natural Resource grant piece so that all the funders know who has the skin in the game and where's it at, with the understanding it's kind of that layer cake of funding. And I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with kind of putting those pieces together. And then you're hoping all the pieces come in, but all the funders recognize that it's based on that buy-in. We always like to see, is there some buy-in from the organization that's applying? Not always is that the case, but oftentimes we like to see, are we the only funder at the table? You might have an extremely limited budget. You're asking us because you don't have that money. But that's where it's important to have that organizational budget. If you're sitting on $40 million of assets and you're asking us to provide that software purchase, we're going to ask, well, are you putting anything into the software purchase out of your 40 million? Because if not, then is it just a funding priority of the organization? Maybe it's not important enough to allocate the resources for it. Your numbers need to match. I don't know how often I'll look at the end of a grant application and the budget is $25,000 is what they're asking for. But when I add up all their expenses, it only comes to $18,000. So the question is, where's the other $7,000? And they're like, well, in case we need it, or maybe a maybe, or I don't know. It just seemed like a good round number. If you're building in contingency, put what that contingency could be for, because we want to make sure that the numbers do add up, and it's not just kind of picking them out of the air and just rounding it up for no apparent reason. There are lots of templates that are available online. I'm sure all of you have your own budgets. There's for federal applications and other more complicated grant applications, they will give you specific budgets, and Kathy can walk you through that. Don't be afraid of them. Walk through them slowly, get help to do it. But for many others, it's just an Excel spreadsheet. And if you have questions, make sure you reach out. I always say we have a youth grant making body here. All of our community foundations are yackers, and they're the toughest group as far as reviewing. And they first go to the budget, as opposed to maybe our adult board is more, they lead from their heart and they want to see the overall scope. The kids look at it and say, well, how much are they asking for and why? And they're checking the numbers.
It's funny you should say that, Nancy, because I have the same experience with our youth. They're very, very budget oriented for whatever reason. They feel like they have money and they want to keep it. They want to give it out only when it's well applied for. They can really understand the community benefit. So very good. Good budget talk, lots of fun. Thank you, Nancy. And I'm just gonna do a quick overview of, this is kind of like the rundown typically of a federal grant. One of the things I'll draw your attention to is that sometimes it's clear from the grantor that they won't cover certain things. Our community foundation, for example, will very seldom cover the cost of labor in a project. If a project is $25,000 and $8,000 of that is staff, generally that's going to be, they're going to really question it and possibly take that $8,000 right off the project. So you really have to look at your grantor when you are looking at your budget. Sometimes budgets will not allow for capital investment. They will not allow for big stuff to be bought because they're about a mission, mental health. So they're not going to buy a building, you know. So again, your budget is around basically what they're allowing you to spend on. So basically a federal budget form would ask you for these things. And it's basic, just like Nancy drilled down. Federal grants often do cover personnel, because if you're asking for $2 million project cost, you're going to have personnel associated with that. So you're going to have a personnel line item where you're going to put, you know, project director, teachers, extra hours for the chief financial officer, whatever your personnel, that's a line item. You're going to then, I learned this early on because I'm not a CFO, don't forget the fringe benefits that come along, because you don't want to saddle any organization with, hey, here's this beautiful grant. And I got the salary covered, but the fringe benefits you're going to have to eat, because we all know fringe benefits are a huge percentage now of what you pay people. So don't forget about that fringe benefit if this is a larger grant ask. Then there's two categories generally. There's materials and equipment. Really, I always look at these this way, kind of in an, I think more in an auditor's kind of purview. Materials are kind of things that have a shorter lifespan. They're kind of here and there. You'll use them up. They're consumables. They're generally less than $5,000 in cost, you know, per item. Equipment generally is something that's going to have a long life or a longer life than 5 years. And it's generally going to be worth more than $5,000. So, you know, equipment would be a bus, right? A material would be a workbook. So, you know, therein is your difference. Just two very low, minor examples. Contracted work, what does that look like? Well, this is not staff that you already have on staff. This isn't your personnel. Contracted work is, for example, I alluded to earlier, applying for a professional evaluator. She's not on my staff. She's external. So her cost would go under contractual. If I have a project and I'm going to contract with local mental health agencies, that's under the contracted portion. And then the next section I have on here, some grants require match. So you have to, and I have one of these going on right now in my budget. It doesn't look all that beautiful, but I have it there. This particular grant that I'm working on has a 45% match. So the grant could give us 55% of the project, and I have to show that I have promised match of 45%. So you have to have your people all lined up, and you have to have letters proving that you have that match waiting. It's ready and promised and approved if you should get the 55% grant ask. So that's the match. Sometimes it's required cash. The grant I'm working on right now is a cash match. If I'm asking for $100,000, I have to have 45% of that in cash promised. Sometimes, and I've leveraged this a lot in grants, sometimes that match can be in kind or volunteer. So for example, in the school realm, I was a principal counselor, at one point a teacher. So I knew that I had kind of a hourly value, let's just say, of $55 an hour. That usually went with federal grants. So not my grant writing, because that's pre-project, that never really applied. But I looked at, okay, as a counselor, how many hours am I going to spend on this youth mental health first aid initiative over a year? And I'd say, well, it's going to be 15 hours a week. And at $55 an hour, that's an in-kind. And that was often how I did in-kind matching, or whomever I needed to leverage that was willing to just put skin in the game and hours toward a project without pay. So you have to, of course, ask, and you have to have that solidified before you just start putting names in, unless it's yourself that you're promising. And then a term I stumbled into, and again, most of you on the call know this, but I didn't initially, indirect cost. To me, it was just a complication. It's like I was getting ready to launch this thing, send it, submit it. And then on the budget, there's this indirect cost. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. What does that mean? So really the first several grants I wrote, I just put a 0 in and realized that, whoa, am I ever missing out on something here? An indirect cost rate, school districts, for example, I know have negotiated indirect cost rates through the Michigan Department of Education. So those are posted on the MDE website. So as a school district applicant, I always go there and I look, oh, okay, we're at 12.5% or 11.8%. It changes every year based on census data and other things. Other organizations may have an indirect cost rate established through another entity, through another umbrella organization. But if you don't, oftentimes the larger grant applications have what they call, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, a de minimis indirect cost rate of 10%. That's true of one I'm writing right now. So if you just stop and think about this for a minute, what is an indirect cost? An indirect cost is something that you can't really quantify. It's lights. You don't know how much electricity you're going to use towards your lights in a grant project. You can't quantify that. How much print cartridge you're going to consume, because that's not something you can quantify. How much heat are you going to use in a room that the project is hosted in? These are all indirect costs that you can't quantify. So usually your governmental organizations that are granting dollars will tell you, we understand that those are real costs. If the lights are on and the heat is on and gas is in the vehicle, so on and so forth, we're going to give you 10% indirect cost. And so that's really critical. That's a lot of money on the table if you're not taking advantage of that, if you could use it. And quite honestly, I've never been in an instance in the past couple of decades where I've ever been called upon to prove an indirect cost, because you can't. You just can't. So you draw down that 10% every time they give you money for the project. You're drawing down that 10% in addition for indirect costs. So that's just really crucial. Do your homework and don't not go there and do that. So that's pretty much the moving parts of a budget. This is the part that I find the most fun. And for those of you who've hung on the line, this is what a lot of people ask. They say, okay, I get the grant framework. I get all of that. I can do all of that. How do you find these things? That's typically the question. And so I'm going to give you just a laundry list here of places that I've gone. And I'm going to highlight a few that I think are really significant. And this is just based on my narrow background, my narrow experience with this. I have an app on my phone for grants.gov. Some people are so turned off by grants.gov because it's so cumbersome and so overwhelming, but get in there and just do a search for what it is that your mission is. Just go do that. If it's education, then click Department of Education and look what's available. Just, you don't have to apply for anything, but be aware of that. That is, I told you earlier that I'm probably around $30 million of successful grants. Most all of them came by way of looking at grants.gov. So though it's a turnoff and it's overwhelming, that's typically where big dollars are. So don't shy away from that. GuideStar is basically a place where you can go, and I think we can send you this PowerPoint too. Can we not, Melissa? At any rate, those of you who might be writing this down, I think we have the capacity to send this to you. And so it's all, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, we will send.
Okay. Great. So GuideStar really is a list of nonprofits that you might be able to apply to. That's a place to look. Grant Alert, I think there's like the free information there, and then there's for pay information. Be really leery of places that are offering you information for grants for a monthly subscription. And I'm not saying they're all bad. I'm just saying that oftentimes you can do your due diligence behind the scenes and not have to pay for anything. And I'm on all of these listservs, so I get these. They send me, like everybody does, they send you a list of current grant opportunities, and then they'll say, click here to subscribe to us, for a fee. Well, I just look at what they have to offer and then I move on. I kind of harvest the information that they give me for free. So Grant Alert is one of those, Grant Siren is another. MSU Library has a really cool site. I've been there frequently. I've gotten some small grants from that list. They don't update it a lot. So you're going to find a lot of dead links on there. I mean, the last time I went there, which was a while ago, but it's something to look at. Philanthropy News Digest actually has just a wealth of information, a lot of really, really nice articles that you can read. But then if you drill down to the bottom of their emails, there's usually a list of RFPs that may or may not be of interest to you, but it's pretty simple just to read through it and see if one really speaks to your organization's mission or a community need. Well, then click on it and go there. That's a free thing too. I'm on a listserv for Seliger and Associates, which is a big grant writing firm out of California. They have a short list of grant opportunities, and they're soliciting really for you to want one of those grants and then solicit their work to write them for 5 to 10 grand or whatever. I mean, so, and that's all fine. If you want to go there and do that, that's good. But if you just sign up, you get some of the highlights of they've combed through what's available on grants.gov, and they kind of finesse it and put it in front of you in kind of a readable way. Just an agency. Some of these are just agencies that I think are great. The Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs is great for historical and arts related projects in a community or school. They let out for grants quite a bit. I was able to start a violin club for a school district with that. I was able to do a moving art exhibit for school districts using that. They do a lot of things. So you could go there and look at their grant cycle if you're looking for something grants or arts related. And sometimes a fairly substantial amount of money, not millions, but up to maybe 25,000. Another one's the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. They have just so many opportunities. You can also find that on grants.gov just by going to that tab and searching for that agency. But they have a lot going on at the state level if you're representing a rural area. They have some out right now around healthcare, actually. So they're interested in all of rural America. So you might want to go there. The Herbert H. Grace and A. Dow Foundation, again, that I have not got a grant from them, but just these are places to go and look. Grant Space is another one of those things that you can sign up for, and they send you high-level information about different things. GuideStar is more of a global, here's a whole bunch of nonprofits, kind of hard to navigate through, but sometimes can be just a quick read, and you can kind of do a search by state or region or whatever. Grant Helpers is another place. The Foundation Center, that's huge, but a lot of good information. The Grantsmanship Center, these are big. One of the things I often tell people who are just starting, and this is kind of where I fell into grant writing, is I began to, as I'm driving through my community, right? And I lived in rural America, I drove past things like Walmart, and I began to ask the question, does Walmart have a foundation? Might they give to my project because they are in my location? Walmart does have a foundation, and did you know that Walmart nationally is the biggest funder out there? They grant the most dollars. So, look on the streets in your community. Is there a O'Reilly car repair place? Vet them out online, see if there's a foundation, because there's one in your area. Is there a state farm agent? I bet you there is. And there's a state farm foundation, and I've got state farm funding for a writing project in a school district. So wherever you see a name that might scream, wow, they probably got some money behind them and probably want to do some community good, go right to the corporate site. And sometimes you're going to look on community impact tab. Sometimes there's a grant tab or, service tab. They kind of name it differently, but go there and look at that. So I've listed some examples, Chemical Bank Foundation, Consumers Energy Foundation. I mentioned the Detroit, I mentioned the DAF donation that came from Detroit, DTE Foundation, your local United Way. And then, so again, look local and go there and talk to your managers. I wouldn't talk to like cashiers or people at the service desk, because sometimes they're not really in tune with the philanthropy of their large organization. But go talk to the manager of your local Walmart. I got $5,000 once from going and talking to the manager directly about a reading project. I wanted a guided reading series as a principal. I didn't have money for it. It was $5,000. I went and talked. They gave me a paper. They ran it up the flagpole to their supervisor, and in the mail came $5,000 check, 2 or 3 months later. So don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to do a little research. So here's another tip. This particular, I've used this quite a bit. It's called the Foundation Directory Online. This comes with a caveat. If you're looking for grants from governmental agencies, well, go to grants.gov. If you're looking for local donations, well, go to Charity Navigator and look up local charities in your area. If you're looking perhaps for those, what I'd call hidden foundations, they're ones that aren't necessarily in your community. They're out there, the funders are out there, but you don't know who they are by name, and you can't find them by Googling. Like, that's a thing. You can't find these necessarily by Googling. This particular online directory is very, very good. It's you have to pay for it, and you have to pay dearly for it, but I'm going to tell you how to access it through the back end. And some of you already know this. It's called the Foundation Directory Online, and it's typically found at universities. I used to go to Michigan State University to use theirs. You just come in and use their terminal, and they had a license for it. So here I looked in the state of Michigan to find who currently has a subscription to this so that you could go there and use it. Traverse City, Grand Rapids, Saginaw, MSU, Kalamazoo, Helen Bader, Marquette, Farmington, University of Michigan, closest to me where I'm at, Clinton Macomb Public Library. I'm working with Oxford Public Library also to get this. And so this program, you're saying, well, why does it cost so much? Because again, I'm trying to find funding for pre-K literacy in our area. So if I just were to go out on Google and search pre-K literacy funders, I'm just going to get 5 million hits that I'll get lost in right away, that none of them apply to me. If I use Foundation Directory Online, go to my local library, they're going to tell me how to get on board. And then it's pretty simple. I'm going to put in perhaps my state, or I'm going to put in perhaps my county, and then I'm going to put in early literacy. And then up comes these foundations that I'd never heard of before, some private, some family, and some other that they weren't on my radar. And so then it tells you the site to go to, the contact. It's a beautiful thing. So I haven't been in a while. I paid for this for a short period of time to do some targeted research. And then it's a month-to-month subscription really. And I think I paid, just so you know, $199 per month that I had it. And then I used it for 2-3 months, and then I just let it go because I dug deep. I did my research. That was worth the $600 to me. and then I let it go, and then I'll reach back out. But these institutions won't charge you. You can go there, use it. You know, give yourself plenty of time to do 4 hours of research. And they're great. So I would go to those places. That's a handy funder. And so you got your source to look up foundations, and many that you have never heard of. You've got your free listservs you can be on and get all that information for free. And then you've got grants.gov. I navigate them all the time. And then the beauty of that, I'm not going to apply all the time, but I know nonprofits and school districts that might be interested in something. So I see something, I'll send it to them. So in fact, I just had a call today, a similar approach. I made somebody aware of something. So these are additional tips here. Nancy, was this you? Because I lost track. It was.
Yes, this
Over
is
to you,
me. And
Nancy.
I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we get to questions because everyone's being so patient, and we've gone through some of this before. You will get a copy of these slides, so I know you can read through it as much as I can read it to you. But a couple things, one that's not on here, just kind of in a wrap up on my end. When you're writing a grant application, and I don't think either of us kind of mentioned it up front, maybe indirectly, but make no assumptions that the funder knows anything about you. That is something that from a local community foundation, I see often. We kind of know what we do. And I'll find when I'm even giving a presentation to folks about what is a community foundation, I just assume they know and that they're coming with some basic knowledge. Assume when you're writing this that your audience of the grantor has no idea who you are or what you do, so that you're giving them the relevant information to be able to make an assessment of your project and your organization. The rest of these you can read about, not copying from one proposal to another. You can get caught up in forgetting who you're asking for what, or maybe not answering the questions. We've talked about citing sources and your budget and your objectives, but really just be concise and honest, speak human, and be nice. Impressions do last. If you make those calls up front, you know, just be really gracious of people's times. I've seen that on both ends of the grant application process, and knowing that, you know, sometimes I get frustrated, and some of you might too, that people are coming to you for money, and you're thinking, you know, this isn't a for sure. And if you're asking someone for money, you want to be nice about it and answer the questions that they ask. You don't think you have to always say that, but we do put it in here. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy because, like I said, I want to keep it short so we can get to your questions.
Absolutely. And this last page again is just high level information, and I won't read through all of it, but again, you'll get this emailed out to you. Some of it's kind of redundant to what we've already said. But Melissa, I think now with a little bit of time remaining, and I can hang on to answer questions too. I can't speak for Nancy, but even if we go beyond.
I can.
Okay, do you want to share with us some questions? And we'll do our best to answer. But again, remember, neither of us call ourselves full-time grant writers, and this isn't for fee. We're just wanting to be in a space to help and convene. So be patient with us. Go ahead, Melissa.
Well, there was a question and I answered it here. They said, is it okay if they leave a voicemail for an individual when they're calling for a grant? I thought that was okay. And just to say, you know, I have the grant application here. This is the one I was specifically going to respond to. And I just had a few questions before I submit. There, right?
Yeah, I find that refreshing, actually, that people reach out and ask the question. And if you leave a message, you might want to be as specific as you can, but as short as you can, you know, so that the caller, when they return your call, know what to be prepared for. So that would be my advice, but sure, calls are welcome.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. Catherine says, please give an example of fringe benefits and how does that fit into a budget?
Yeah, so fringe benefits, like, for example, if I were writing a grant proposal for a student club, and the funder said it was okay to ask for personnel costs, it would take a teacher to operate that. And there's a fringe benefit related to the cost of that teacher. If we're paying that teacher $55 to stay after school on the afternoons to do the club, then there's fringe benefit percentage that has to go along with that. You won't know that, but the person who does payroll will, and they'll appreciate you asking and they'll help you. So that's a fringe benefit. Fringe benefits basically are the insurance, the unemployment, health benefits, vision, all of that kind of stuff that kind of goes along with a salary. So very good question.
If you have other questions, please put them in the chat as well. Is it okay with both of you if I launch that last poll that we have? This is our kind of wrap.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
And Kathy, maybe you want to share the contact information for us. And
Oh, sure. Thank you.
And while we're launching the poll and people are answering, not only if you have questions, but if you have information to share, if you have success stories or things you've learned in the trenches of writing grants, or even if you disagree with what we've said and you haven't found it helpful, but something else has, we want to learn from you too, because I think there's a wealth of experience on this call that I'd like to mine.
Right. Exactly. Me too.
I really appreciate that you talked about like, what is the right amount to ask for? And, I find that we have some National Days of Service grants, and you're 100% right when you say that if you you need to apply for how much to do the project, and that, as you said, it's very visible. It's very, a grant reviewer can see that you're just asking for the full amount. We sometimes have that, and it's kind of unfortunate because I wish that they had talked to us. I wish that they had realized that kind of what the point of the grant was. A lot of times for us it's generating volunteers. So interesting to me though, and I'm glad that you addressed that.
I would add to that just one quick thing though. Sometimes people will do this crazy thing. Like if a grant says you can apply for up to $100,000, some grant applications will be, and you'll see it on the back end when they're awarded, they ask for $99,900. Like what? That doesn't, I don't know why that is. Sometimes people are real sensitive to ask for the ceiling. I have to tell you, if I can warrant it in my grant proposal and in my budget, I ask for the ceiling. I'm not going to lowball it. If I need it, I'm going to ask for it. So, again, I'm not going to make stuff up. It's not fluff. There's all, but I don't have a sensitivity around, oh, they can give me up to 100,000. I'm not going to be stingy. I'll just apply for 20 to do kind of a fourth of the project I'd like to do. No, why write it? Go, if you can back it up, I say go for the full amount.
I'll piggyback on that too, Kathy, because I've seen people not take advantage of the administrative percentage that is oftentimes allowable in a grant application. Kind of some of the same reasoning of I don't want to ask for it and I might have better chances without it. And, that's the funder saying, we know that there's that cost associated with this project. So certainly take advantage of it, because I don't, you get knee deep into a project and you realize, wow, this is a lot more time than I ever anticipated managing it. And that allows you some of that cost, recouping some of it.
Right.
There was a great question here about what's the best way to do follow-up on a failed grant, like for one that was not granted? Are there any tips for navigating that conversation? I think that's an awesome question.
I think so too. There's different approaches for that. If it's the community foundation, call your executive director and ask. And generally when we send the few rejection letters out, we delineate why. On federal grants, typically you have access to the reviewer's comments, which are hugely important. If I don't get one when it's happened, you're disappointed and yada, yada. But if you can print off the reviewer's comments and put it in a file, you can go back to that if you should ever write to that particular grantor again. And quite honestly, there have been times I have said, I hit submit because the deadline is there. I've got it kind of there, not fully baked. I'm not 100% sure it's at its best, but the timeline's telling me I got to send it. So sometimes I'm like, probably got a 60% chance of that one. And I get them. But again, the reviewers' comments are fantastic because I go back and look at where my shortcomings were. Even if I were granted, I'm looking at those reviews because if I go back to them again for another project, I kind of know then what I need to spend more time on. Also, very, very important, we didn't say it, but some of the larger grants that you'll write tell you, it's kind of like taking an English class and your teacher or your professor gives you a rubric and they tell you, okay, your introductory paragraph is going to be worth 10 points out of 100. The body of your essay is going to be worth 60% out of 100. You have to have the budget, but it won't count for any points at all. So that rubric, if you will, that template that they give you, the points, if that tells me that 80% of a grant application is judged based on need, I'm going to nail that section really hard. I'm going to spend most of my time there. So if they give you the percentages or the points, concentrate on them accordingly. If there's no points associated with the budget, I'm not going to spend 90% of my time developing a budget. I'm going to do it and I'm going to do my due diligence, but I'm going to go where the points are. And I think that's really, most people know that, but be sure that you're doing that.
As you were talking, Kathy, this is unrelated to these questions, but it's coming into my brain, so I want to get it out before we lose track of time here. The two things that we didn't talk about is make sure that you're paying attention to the follow-up, what's needed after you're awarded a grant. So once you're given a grant, usually there's an agreement you have to sign, and then there's a final grant report. There might be interim reports as your project goes along. Make sure you're paying attention to those. One, because there's a requirement, it's a contract that you're taking the money and you're gonna do them. But two, that's also an indication for future funding. If you're not following up with deadlines and those final grant reports, a funder's going to they might flag you in a system if it's a larger organization or a smaller that you don't have that final grant closeout. And the other thing is to keep your funder in the loop of unexpecteds. I don't know how many times I'm currently right now in the middle of a grant that, the deadline to spend all the money was December 31st, but because of, the pandemic and some changes in operations, we didn't get it all spent. And, rather than panicking, I've kept the funder in the loop all along, and they can be understanding. Some might not have that flexibility, but oftentimes they recognize that the unexpected can happen. So don't be afraid to let them know, hey, either the project's going sideways or it's delayed, or we've had some unexpected things come up, because it's a relationship, and everyone in the loop can make it go smoothly and preserve future funding as well.
There was a question to that. How do you keep track of all the application opening and closing dates when searching for grant opportunities and planning to apply for multiple grants through the year? And then David actually had a great idea, created a spreadsheet when researching the grant opportunities that include a column, the open and close date, and you could sort the table based on the opening and closing dates. I love that. That was a great tip.
That is a great idea.
Yeah. Do you have any other tips on that?
No, I've done the exact same thing, and it doesn't have to be real beautiful either. Just I've done it on notebook paper, right? I mean, here's the grantor, here's the opening date, here's the closing date. And this is the floor of the grant you can ask for. This is the ceiling. And so you've got your basic information there, and fill that out either on a piece of notebook paper or on a Google spreadsheet or whatever. And quite honestly, if you're working for an organization that's very, very interested in what you're looking at or reviewing, that's really, that's important. You'd share that to your supervisor, right? If it's something
Yeah.
that you're required to do. So that stands to reason that you would do that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, are there any other questions? This was just a wonderful conversation and so much information, great information.
Both of us are very open. If you have any follow-up questions or things that you want to share, please feel free to reach out. You'll get a copy of the slides. I know our contact information was there.
Yeah, I'll send those out along with the recording. I'll get some help from our communications person on doing this recording, but I'll send that out to everyone because I know that there were some folks there were quite a few people that were on the call that dropped off or they didn't get on. So, and I know that they were looking forward to this. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate everyone being here, and to our wonderful presenters, thank you so much. You were phenomenal.
Could I ask a favor of everybody on the
Yes.
call who's still remaining? This is very simple, but I've told Nancy earlier that I really feel like every time we have a grant writing workshop of any kind, we have a lot of people come, which is great. And we do this high level, we kind of hit the middle from novice to people who know more than we do. My question is this: if anybody would be interested in a monthly or every other month kind of workshop where we could bring forward any project that we're trying to research or a grant we're trying to build and we just don't get this one component. Gosh, when you're the only person in a room trying to develop something, it can be so daunting. If you're interested in like a monthly or bi-monthly, you wouldn't have, there's no subscription. It'd just be kind of like a work group to noodle on, if you will, different things you're working on. If you're interested in that, let me know, because I would be willing to put together a group invite, and anybody who's got something that's burning could bring it forward. All of these minds would be a terrible thing to waste. So if that's of interest or value, let me know, or let Nancy know or Melissa know, because I think that would be a great way to network nonprofits together. We're all looking to strengthen our missions, and sometimes that requires grants, and so we should be a support network for one another.
You know what, Kathy, what about if we planned a networking session that we've talked about with the VGF partners? What plan one of those, and you're one of the next ones, and you do it on grant writing, we can let everybody know they were here today or they missed it and they'd still like to come, they could. And then that could be launched from there. Yeah, I'd be happy with that if you'd like.
I think that would be phenomenal. And then again, you might not be working on a grant and you might not attend, and that's fine. But when one pops up and you have questions and you'd like some colleagues' input, I mean, I think that's great. Yeah, I support that, Melissa.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. How about if I work on that end on my time?
Okay.
And then and then Jacqueline asked, is this taped? We did record it, and I'll send out the recording when I send out the you can look at it again because I'll send out the slides too. Oh, good, everyone. Thank you. Well, again, my sincerest thanks to our wonderful presenters today. You did a phenomenal job, and to everyone that's here. This is just a wealth of information. I look forward to, I'm excited about the opportunity to follow up with the networking, and we can kind of talk about some of those things. And you have some experts here, and we'll bring some more, we'll hear from all of you, and it'll just be a nice conversation. So we'll work on that next. Did you see, Jacqueline says, our presenters are awesome.
Oh, thank you, everyone. Much
you.
Appreciated.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Take care.
Take care.
Have a great day.